At 73 years old, I sat in a lawyer's office and listened to my own two children explain, with a calm that still unsettles me when I think about it, why it made more financial sense for the house to be in their names instead of mine. My name is Mason Parker. I built that house with my own hands, room by room, over 11 years, starting when my children were small enough to hand me nails from a coffee can while I worked. I want to tell you what happened after that meeting, why I ended up on a plane to the Philippines with considerably less than I expected to retire with, and what I learned about the difference between the family you raise and the family that shows up when it matters. The house sat on 4 acres outside a small town in Missouri. My late wife Carol and I bought the land in 1983 with almost nothing in savings and a construction loan that terrified both of us. I worked as an electrical contractor during the day and framed walls on that property most evenings and every weekend for the better part of a decade. Our 2 children, Daniel and Rebecca, grew up in that house. It was not just an asset to me. It was the physical record of 30 years of Carol's and my life together, and after she passed 6 years ago, it became something closer to a shrine than a piece of real estate. I understand looking back that this emotional attachment is exactly what made me vulnerable to what happened next, though I did not see it that way at the time. About 2 years ago, Daniel approached me with a proposal that, on its surface, sounded entirely reasonable, even generous. He explained that transferring the house into his and Rebecca's names while I was still alive would avoid significant estate taxes and probate complications down the road, protecting what I had built from being eroded by legal fees and government claims after I was gone. He brought an attorney to explain the mechanics of it, a specific kind of arrangement that allowed me to retain what was described as a life estate, meaning I would continue living in the house for as long as I wished, while ownership technically transferred to my children in the present. I want to be honest about my state of mind at the time. I was still not fully recovered from losing Carol. I trusted my children completely, the way you trust the 2 people you raised and fed and stayed up with through fevers and heartbreaks and everything in between. I signed the documents. I did not consult a second attorney. I did not fully understand, until it was too late to matter, that a life estate arrangement gives the remainder owners, my children in this case, certain rights that I had not fully appreciated, including significant influence over decisions about the property that I had assumed would remain entirely mine. The trouble began roughly 8 months after I signed. Daniel and his wife had accumulated debt from a failed business venture, and Rebecca, who had moved out of state for work, needed cash for a down payment on her own home. Between the 2 of them, they decided that selling the property was the most practical path forward. I found out through a phone call from Daniel that felt, in retrospect, more like a courtesy notification than a conversation. He explained that legally, as co-owners of record, he and Rebecca had the authority to force a sale of the property, even against my wishes, through a legal process called partition, if I did not agree to sell voluntarily. He framed it at the time as something he genuinely did not want to do, something he hoped we would not have to go through the courts for. But the message underneath the message was clear. The house Carol and I had built with our own hands, room by room, over 11 years, was no longer legally mine to protect, and my own children were prepared to force its sale through the courts if I resisted. Before I tell you what I did next, subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell. Every week on this channel we cover exactly this kind of situation, the legal arrangements that sound protective on paper, but leave seniors vulnerable in practice. Next week, I am covering the specific questions every senior needs to ask an independent attorney before signing any property transfer, life estate, or family trust document. Subscribe now, because what happened to me was preventable, and I do not want it to happen to you. I want to be honest about the months that followed, because I think the sanitized version of this story does a disservice to anyone watching who might be facing something similar right now. I did not handle it gracefully. There were arguments with Daniel that ended with both of us saying things neither of us has fully walked back to this day. There was a period of about 4 months where Rebecca and I did not speak at all, following a conversation where I said something about her financial priorities that I regret, even though the underlying frustration behind it was not unreasonable. I consulted a second attorney, finally, far too late to undo what had already been legally established, and he confirmed what I already suspected. The arrangement was legal, properly executed, and largely irreversible without my children's voluntary cooperation, which was clearly not forthcoming. The house sold 4 months after that initial phone call. I received a portion of the proceeds, structured to reflect my life estate interest, which amounted to considerably less than half of what the property was actually worth, and considerably less than I had spent 30 years assuming would fund a comfortable retirement in the home I had built. I moved into a small rented apartment in town, 73 years old, functionally starting my retirement savings over with a fraction of what I had planned, and carrying a grief about my children that felt, in some ways, sharper than losing Carol had been, because Carol's loss had not come with betrayal attached to it. I spent close to a year in that apartment doing very little beyond attending a part-time consulting gig I had picked up to supplement what remained of my savings, and avoiding calls from both of my children with a consistency that I am not particularly proud of now. The decision to leave the country was not, if I am being fully honest with you, a well-reasoned financial strategy. It was closer to an act of removal. I could not walk past the end of my old road without seeing the house. I could not attend the small church I had gone to for 20 years without running into people who knew exactly what had happened and looked at me with a specific kind of pity I found harder to tolerate than almost anything else in that entire period. A cousin of Carol's, who had spent several years living in the Philippines with her late husband, mentioned during a phone call that the reduced cost of living there meant my remaining savings and Social Security would stretch considerably further than they would in Missouri. I did not research this decision carefully. I researched it the way a man researches something he has already decided to do and is simply looking for permission to act on. 11 weeks after that phone call, I was on a flight to Cebu, alone, carrying 2 suitcases and a level of anger toward my own children that I did not fully understand the depth of until I was sitting on that plane with nothing left to distract me from it. The first months in the Philippines were not the healing experience the travel channels make this kind of move look like. I want to be clear about that. I was a genuinely angry man in an unfamiliar country, and anger does not simply dissolve because the scenery changed. I picked fights with hotel staff over minor billing discrepancies that did not deserve the intensity I brought to them. I avoided the small community of other American retirees in the area for the first 2 months because I did not want to explain my situation to strangers and watch their faces do the same pitying thing my neighbors back home had done. I called my son exactly once during that period, a call that ended after roughly 4 minutes with both of us raising our voices before I hung up first. What began to shift things was a man named Alberto, who ran a small hardware and repair shop 2 blocks from the apartment I had rented in a coastal town outside Cebu City. I had gone in looking for a specific tool to fix a broken cabinet hinge, and in the process of helping me find it, he asked, in the direct way I would come to learn was fairly typical there, why an American my age was living alone in his town without any family visiting. I gave him a short, sharp version of the story, expecting the conversation to end there the way most casual conversations do when they hit something uncomfortable. Instead, he set down what he was doing, made 2 cups of coffee from a pot behind his counter, and asked me to tell him the whole thing properly. I did, more of it than I intended, standing in a hardware shop with a man I had known for 11 minutes. When I finished, he said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. He said, in careful English, "Your children took a house. That is a real loss, and I am sorry for it. But you are still deciding, every day since, to also give them your peace. That is a second thing you are handing them, and I do not think they asked for that one." I did not have a response to that. I bought my hinge and left, somewhat abruptly, because I did not know what to do with a stranger seeing something that clearly. But I went back to that shop 3 days later, without needing anything in particular, and Alberto poured 2 more cups of coffee without being asked, as though he had been expecting me. Over the following months, that shop became something like an anchor point in my week. Alberto introduced me to a small group of men, mostly local, a few fellow expats, who gathered most evenings to play checkers and mahjong on a folding table outside his shop after closing. I was terrible at mahjong for the better part of 3 months, and they found this genuinely delightful in a way that somehow never felt unkind. I called Rebecca on her birthday, roughly 7 months into my time there, the first real conversation we had attempted since the sale. I did not apologize for feeling betrayed, because I still do, and I told her so plainly. But I apologize for the specific things I had said about her during that 4-month silence, comments that had more to do with my grief than with her actual character, and I asked her, directly, whether the down payment on her house had worked out the way she needed it to. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she told me it had, and that her daughter, my granddaughter, had just started at a new elementary school near their new home. We talked for almost 40 minutes. It was not a full repair. I do not know if a full repair is coming, or if it should. But it was a door that had been shut for 7 months, opened by a crack, and I have Alberto's coffee and his uncomfortably accurate observation to thank for that crack existing at all. My relationship with Daniel remains more distant than my relationship with Rebecca, and I am not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidy ending. We exchange messages a few times a month, brief and functional, and I do not know yet whether that will change. What I do know is that I no longer spend my mornings the way I spent the first 4 months here, replaying that phone call, rehearsing arguments I never get to have because the person I am arguing with is not actually in the room. My mornings now generally involve coffee on a small balcony that looks out at the water, a walk that takes me past Alberto's shop most days, whether I need anything or not, and a level of financial comfort that, while smaller than what I once expected, is genuinely sufficient. My monthly expenses here run just under $900, including rent, and between Social Security and what remains of my savings, I am not in the precarious position I feared I would be in when I first left that lawyer's office 2 years ago. If you are watching this and something similar has happened in your family, a property arrangement that seemed protective and turned out to be something else, a betrayal wearing the disguise of financial planning, I am not going to tell you that moving across the world is the answer, because for most people it is not, and I do not think it was even the correct answer for me, so much as it was the only door I was capable of walking through at the time. But I will tell you what Alberto told me over that first cup of coffee, because I think it applies regardless of where you are sitting while you watch this. What was taken from you is real, and you are allowed to grieve it and to be angry about it for exactly as long as you need to be. But do not hand over your peace on top of it, because that second thing was never part of what they took, and it is the one piece you still get to decide about entirely on your own. Subscribe to Mason Parker USA and turn on the notification bell.